On this weekend, throughout our country, we are celebrating Respect Life Sunday. And this appears to be fairly simple, but it's very all-embracing and very complicated. Later. Thank you. It's all-embracing and very complicated. When you say you are pro-life, you must be consistent. There's a consistent ethic here. It involves all life. Life before birth, life right through the end of natural living. It includes victims of war, how we stand in the issue of war. I was very saddened this past week when Kelly Gisandner was executed in Georgia. The death penalty is obscene to those who are pro-life. It involves our attitude and predisposition toward refugees, toward immigrants, toward those who are poor and struggling, to those who are morally bankrupt, our compassionate understanding for all people. If we are to gather something from the afterglow of Pope Francis' visit among us, it must be for a gospel of compassion, a gospel of patience, a gospel of acceptance, a gospel of affirmation and understanding. That's what it means to be pro-life. Anything short of this isn't pro-life. It's kind of a partial, selective dealing with issues. So that when we get to say we're pro-life, it's a very demanding self-identification. It's a very demanding enterprise when you think about it. It involves everything. It involves our families, it involves forgiveness, it involves compassion, it involves the whole scheme and the whole tapestry of life. Today, the readings deal with marriage and divorce. So I'd like to focus on Respect Life through the lens of the issue of marriage and divorce, especially in our church, since the Synod is about to begin in Rome, and the Synod will deal with this whole issue of people in second marriages who belong to our communities. There are various levels of conversation to deal with here. There's the Code of Canon Law. 1,752 canons make up the corpus of the Code of Canon Law, first codified in 1918, where they gathered all of the disciplines of the church and codified them into one central place. It was renewed and revised in 1983, and the code which is presently in place comes from 1983. And it deals with all disciplines within our Catholic tradition. The code of law is necessary, but it's not absolute. So we need the code of law, otherwise we have chaos. At the same time, we need to humanize, normalize, and somehow integrate the code of law into the place in which we find ourselves. That's the first level of conversation. The second and more important level of conversation has to do with God's revealed word spoken to us in our proclamations today. That first reading comes from the second chapter of the book of Genesis. And you will remember in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, we have the creation story. The first day, second day, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and the seventh day, God rests. It's a story. It's just meant to tell us about creation. You can't take it literally. I mean, if God's infinite, why did he have to rest? And why did it take 6 days? So you must interpret this in an intelligent, biblical way. In chapter 2 in the book of Genesis is a radically different story of creation, and that's what we have in our first reading today. God gave Adam everything. He had everything. And yet he had everything in the story. And everything was perfect, but his life was not complete. So it says in the story that God put him into a sleep, took a rib-made woman, and that he said, at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, at last my life is fulfilled. Why is his life fulfilled? Because he met his equal. Until you meet your equal, your life is never fulfilled. If you're a control freak, you're in charge, and you must have the last word, you are an unhappy person. Your life is fulfilled when you meet your equal, when you know that the other person actually is a part of you. The other person belongs to you. The other person is born out of your humanity. That's when life somehow begins to take on meaning. And that's the core teaching of this second chapter of the book of Genesis, which is our first reading today. The gospel comes from the 10th chapter of the book of Mark. Now, this requires, when we come to the scriptures, we need to read the scriptures, but we need to also listen to the teaching of the church, which is enlightened, somehow enlightened and enriched by biblical and theological scholarship. Insofar as it's enlightened, it becomes a gift to us. When you read this gospel which we have today, if a man divorces his wife, and if a woman divorces her husband, well, Jesus did not say that. If a woman divorces her husband, because in the time of Jesus, in the Semitic tradition, the woman wasn't allowed to get a divorce. Read back in the 24th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, part of the Torah. In the beginning of chapter 24, in this it says, if a man is displeased with his wife, just displeased, he can give her a writ of separation and send her away. Not the woman, not the man. It's a patriarchal tradition. You'll find in the Gospels, you'll find the very same echo. The man divorces his wife. You'll find it in the commandments. Don't covet your neighbor's goods. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. It doesn't say don't covet your neighbor's husband, which just might happen occasionally, but it doesn't say that. It says don't covet your neighbor. It all comes out of this very patristic tradition, which is patriarchal. So we have to interpret the scriptures. This is a redaction that somebody wrote in about the woman divorcing her husband. Read around through the Gospels. So you'll find in Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 5, verse 30, it says the man must not divorce his wife. But then in verse 31, chapter 5 in Matthew, and I know you'll look it up because you're listening to this, and in verse 31 it says, a man divorces his wife except in the case of uncleanness or something. The Greek word is porneia. It also appears in the 19th chapter of Matthew's Gospel in verse 19. And you'll see this, except for uncleanness or unlawfulness. The Greek word is porneia. Wherever Matthew's Gospel was shaped, in Antioch of Syria, whatever was happening, we don't know exactly what porneia means, but there was a lot of porneia going on, whatever it was. And whatever it was, the man could divorce his wife, except in the case of porneia, then he could divorce his wife. However, in these references, it does say he gives her a writ of separation. And again, it reflects the Semitic tradition, which is patriarchal. So we need to take the scriptures and begin to look at them in context with some sense of scholarship, some sense of study. Listen to the scholars when you read the scriptures. The notion of divorce is by no means absolutely clear in the teachings of the gospel. It requires much study. Now, way back there in the Council of Trent in 1547, almost the last document in the Council of Trent, the document called Temesti, dealt with what would be a marriage acceptable in the Catholic Church. Before that, before the Council of Trent, before the 16th century, there were various forms of marriage. There was marriage here and somebody doing it some way and another way. One of my sabbaticals years ago, I spent up in the Turkana Desert in the northern part of Kenya near the Sudan. And the priest up there had been there for 13 years. I stayed with him. And these very nomadic Turkana Desert people, in his 13 years, he had only one wedding in the church. And that was 2 UN workers from Europe. All the tribal people to get married in the tribe. They're married by the chief in the tribe. Do they belong to the church? Of course. That's the way it is in Turkana. Well, this Temesti document out of the Council of Trent pretty much defined, for a valid marriage in the Catholic Church, you have to have a priest and 2 witnesses. Now, this was mediated later in saying, okay, we grew into a bigger world. We have lots of religious traditions. You can get a dispensation from this, and it began to be mediated somewhat. But what it did, unintentionally, was it began to define what was holy and unholy, what was sacred and what was sacrilegious. One being sacred, something else being sacrilegious, because of a law. The law made Christ present here and absent there, a dangerous standard when you begin to look at where the presence of God is to be found. So what do we do in the present context? Way back when I was ordained 51 years ago, annulments were rigid, they were lengthy, and they were unattainable for most people. But in the meantime, the sciences of human behavior have informed us. They've informed us not just about sincerity, but capacity. The person's capacity for an enduring life relationship. So we began to evaluate the whole understanding of this discipline, which was very rigid in times past. In the pastoral sense, very much in the spirit of Pope Francis. The way I have for years evaluated how to respond in a pastoral sense to people in second marriage who want to belong to our community and to the table of the Lord. Does holiness dwell in them? The law is meant to enshrine a value. Laws are necessary. You don't have laws, you have chaos. I mean, you have a red light and a green light. If you didn't have red and green lights, you have chaos. Nobody knows when to go and when not to go. So we need laws. If you deify the law and you say the law is absolute, you create a different kind of chaos. I have a fire truck. You can't go through the red light. We have somebody who's dying. You can't go through the red light. The law is deified. You cannot break the law. There are no exceptions to the law. A different kind of chaos. So we need to honor the law and hold the law up. It needs to be reverenced. We need the law to have some kind of an orderly approach to life. But over here we have another reality, and God has revealed in this also, and that is the yearning, the pain, the struggles, the longings, the desires of people who go through hard times, people who struggle in life, people who want to pray, want to belong, people in whom God dwells somehow. Now, to find a balance between respect for the law and somehow honoring the struggles and the human condition, there is the pastoral reality. Now, very rarely, when I have appointments in the office, very rarely do I have somebody come in to see me. I just wanted to come to tell you how incredible you are. Strangely enough, people don't come to tell me that. They don't come to tell me how incredible they are. I just want to tell you I'm mystical and I'm working in grace. They don't come to tell me that. Most everybody that comes to me is carrying some human burden. And that burden is no different than the burdens I carry myself. We are bone of one's bone and flesh of one's flesh. We belong to one another, and Christ dwells within the community of belonging. A broken, wounded, struggling community. We belong to one another. It's not you and me, it's us. It's a community. And the community struggles. We have pains. We're imperfect. We need to forgive. We need to belong. The woman who comes after an abortion doesn't need a judgment. She needs an embrace. She needs some kind of affirmation. The person in a second marriage doesn't need a legal solution. They need a human solution. They need a belonging. The young person who is confused and struggling, denying and living as it were a pagan, God dwells in the person. We must find a place in the community for the people of God in their human condition. Rumi, the 12th century Persian poet, said, out there, beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. Jürgen Druermann, the German theologian, says, what happens if the language of longing is more correct than the language of reason? We're all in between somewhere. Nobody has arrived. We're in between. We're all carrying the burdens of humanity. And my friends, listen to God's word. Together we are bone of one bone and flesh of one flesh. Amen.